On a scorching afternoon in June 2002, in the sprawling desert suburbs of Maricopa County, Arizona, a woman named Jody Sanchez walked into her home after a routine grocery run and found her 12-year-old daughter sitting alone on the living room floor, staring at the television that wasn't turned on. The house felt different somehow. The air conditioning hummed too loudly in the silence. Her husband's truck sat in the driveway, but he was nowhere to be found. Her 8-year-old son, Matthew, had vanished. For the next 20 years, the question that would haunt this sun-bleached community was simple and terrible. Where did Matthew Sanchez go, and who was the last person to see him alive? The town of Estrella Vista sits 40 minutes west of Phoenix, one of those communities that bloomed suddenly in the late 90s when developers carved subdivisions out of creosote and saguaro. In 2002, it was still finding its identity, caught between rural desert town and modern suburb. Strip malls with terracotta roofs lined the main boulevard. New homes in beige and tan stretched in neat rows toward the mountains. Many families who lived there had moved from California or the Midwest, chasing affordable housing and promises of good schools. The Sanchez family had arrived 3 years earlier from San Diego, where Jody's husband, Richard Sanchez, had worked in construction until the company downsized. Richard was 41 then, a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands and a quiet manner. Jody was 38, a former dental assistant who now stayed home with their 2 children. Their daughter, Christina, was studious and serious, already reading above her grade level. Matthew was different. He was the kind of boy who collected rocks and lizards, who asked questions constantly, whose energy seemed boundless even in the 100-degree heat. The morning of June 14th started the way most summer mornings did in that house. Matthew woke early, before 7, and went straight to the backyard where he'd been building what he called a fort out of cardboard boxes and duct tape. Jody heard him through the open kitchen window, talking to himself in that running narration children sometimes use when playing alone. The sky was already bright and cloudless. The temperature was climbing toward what would be a high of 108 degrees. Richard had night shift at a warehouse distribution center and was still asleep. Christina was in her room reading. Jody made coffee and watched her son through the window. He wore his favorite shirt, a faded green thing with a dinosaur on it that she tried to throw away twice, but he always rescued from the donation bag. His sneakers, purchased only a month before, were already scuffed and dusty. He dragged a milk crate across the concrete patio, positioning it just so. The morning felt ordinary. Unremarkable, safe. Around 10:30, Jody needed to run to the grocery store. They were out of milk and bread, and she wanted to get the shopping done before the real heat of the day settled in. Richard was awake by then, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, still in his pajama pants and a white undershirt. She asked if he'd watch the kids. He nodded, barely looking up from the sports section of the newspaper. Christina was fine on her own, lost in her book. Matthew was still outside. Jody grabbed her purse, her keys, a reusable shopping bag. She called out to Matthew through the back door. "Be good for your dad, stay in the yard." He waved at her without turning around, focused on his construction project. She remembers that wave. She remembers the back of his head, his hair sticking up in the way it always did, resistant to combing. She got in her Honda Civic and drove the 12 minutes to the Safeway on Desert Sky Boulevard. She was gone exactly 1 hour and 17 minutes. She remembers this because the receipt was time-stamped at 11:32, and she'd left the house at 10:28 according to the clock in the car. When she pulled back into the driveway at 11:45, Richard's pickup truck was still there, parked in its usual spot. The front door was unlocked. She carried in 2 bags of groceries, set them on the counter. The house was quiet in that particular way that means no children are playing. She called out, "Matthew, Christina." Christina appeared from the hallway, still holding her book. "Where's your brother?" Jody asked. Christina shrugged. I thought he was outside, but he wasn't outside. The backyard was empty. The cardboard fort sat abandoned. A small toy truck lay on its side in the dirt. The back gate, which was always kept latched, stood open about 6 inches. Jody walked through the house calling Matthew's name. She checked his room, the bathroom, the garage. She went back outside and called louder. The neighbors on the left side were an elderly couple who kept to themselves. On the right side was a rental property, currently vacant. Behind their house was desert, undeveloped land stretching toward the foothills. She walked out the back gate and scanned the brush. Nothing moved except the heat shimmer rising off the pale earth. She called and called. Her voice grew sharp with the beginning of panic. She came back inside and found Richard in the living room. He was dressed now in jeans and a t-shirt, standing near the television. "Matthew's not here," she said. Richard looked at her with an expression she would later describe to investigators as strange. Not worried exactly, almost surprised that she was worried. "He probably went to a friend's house," Richard said, but Matthew didn't have any close friends in the neighborhood yet. They'd only lived there 3 years, and he was the kind of boy who played alone more often than not. "Did you see him leave?" Jody asked. Her heart was beginning to pound now. Richard shook his head. "I was in the shower. I thought he was out back." The shower, Jody calculated times in her head. The house had 2 bathrooms. If Richard had been in the shower in the master bedroom, he wouldn't have heard the front door open. Wouldn't have heard Matthew leaving, but why would Matthew leave? She asked Richard when he'd showered. He seemed uncertain. "Maybe 11, I don't know exactly." She asked if he'd checked on Matthew before getting in the shower. He said no. He said he'd assumed the boy was fine, still playing in the yard. By noon, Jody was on the phone with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who arrived first was a young man named Torres. He took the report seriously from the start. An 8-year-old child, missing less than 2 hours in heat that could be fatal. He asked for a recent photograph. Jody brought out the school picture from that spring. Matthew smiled at the camera with a gap in his front teeth. Deputy Torres radioed for additional units and began organizing a search. Within an hour, 6 more deputies arrived. They walked the immediate neighborhood, knocking on doors. The elderly neighbors on the left side hadn't seen or heard anything. The house on the right was empty. Behind the property, the desert stretched silent and vast. Deputy Torres noted in his report that the father seemed calm, unusually calm. He sat on the front porch while the search expanded, his hands folded in his lap. When Torres asked him to describe the last time he'd seen Matthew, Richard said it was probably around 10:30, maybe 10:45, when the boy was still in the backyard. He said he'd gone inside to shower, and when he came out, he hadn't thought to check on him. "I didn't know he was gone," Richard said. "Not until my wife got home." Clears throat. By 3 in the afternoon, the search had grown to include volunteer firefighters and neighbors who'd heard about the missing child. They formed lines and walked through the desert, calling Matthew's name. The temperature was 106 degrees. Search dogs were brought in. The dogs tracked Matthew's scent from the backyard to the front of the house, then lost it at the curb. This suggested he might have gotten into a vehicle, or that he'd walked on pavement where his scent was harder to follow. Investigators began asking harder questions. They separated Richard and Jody, interviewed them individually. Jody's timeline was clear and confirmed by the grocery store receipt. She'd left at 10:28, returned at 11:45. Richard's timeline was vaguer. He'd been asleep. He'd woken up sometime around 10. He'd drunk coffee. He'd read the newspaper. He'd showered. He couldn't say exactly when he'd done each of these things. Deputies asked about the back gate, who had left it open. Richard said he didn't know. He said it might have been Matthew himself going out to explore, but those who knew Matthew said he'd been warned repeatedly about the desert, about rattlesnakes and the dangers of wandering alone. His mother was strict about that gate. It was always latched, always. Investigators photographed the gate, the latch, the backyard. They photographed the cardboard fort and the toy truck lying in the dust. Small details began to accumulate. The shower in the master bathroom was dry when deputies checked it around 2 in the afternoon. Not damp, completely dry. If Richard had showered at 11, as he'd said, 3 hours earlier, it might be dry. But the house was air-conditioned. The humidity was low. Still, investigators noted it. They noted also that Richard's hair didn't appear wet or recently dried. It looked the same as it had in photographs from days earlier, slightly greasy, uncombed. The media arrived by evening. Local news vans parked along the street. Reporters interviewed neighbors who said they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. The story led the 10 o'clock news. Missing child. Estrella Vista, possibly wandered into the desert. A phone number appeared on screen for tips. The calls began coming in, but none led anywhere. Someone reported seeing a child matching Matthew's description at a gas station 15 miles away, but it turned out to be another family's son. Someone else called to say they'd heard a child crying in the desert the previous night, but that was 12 hours before Matthew disappeared. The first full night passed. Search teams worked through the darkness with flashlights and thermal imaging equipment. They found nothing. In the morning, the Arizona Republic ran Matthew's photo on the front page. The family made a televised plea. Jody sat between Richard and Christina, her face pale and drawn. She begged whoever had Matthew to bring him home. She said he needed his medication. This was news to investigators. What medication? Jody explained that Matthew had mild asthma, nothing serious, but he used an inhaler occasionally. The inhaler was still in his room. Richard sat beside her, silent. His eyes were red but dry. When reporters asked him directly what he wanted to say, he cleared his throat and said, "Just bring him home, please." His voice was steady, flat. The segment aired on every local station. Tips flooded the phone lines again but led nowhere. Days became a week. Search teams covered 40 square miles of desert. They used helicopters. They searched abandoned buildings and construction sites. They dragged retention ponds even though there hadn't been rain in months and most were dry. The FBI became involved, as they often do in missing children cases. Agents interviewed the family again. They gave Richard a polygraph. The results were inconclusive, not a failure but not a pass. The examiner noted that Richard seemed emotionally detached during the process, that his physiological responses didn't match what would be expected from a father whose child was missing. But inconclusive meant nothing legally. It meant only that the questions continued. Investigators began looking at Richard's background more carefully. He had no criminal record, no history of violence. Neighbors described him as quiet, private, a man who kept to himself. His coworkers at the warehouse said he did his job and went home. He didn't socialize much. He seemed tired most of the time, but that was understandable for someone working night shift. One coworker mentioned that Richard had called in the day after Matthew disappeared, saying there was a family emergency. But the night Matthew vanished, Richard had been scheduled off. He hadn't worked. This discrepancy seemed minor, but investigators noted it. They asked Richard about his movements the day before Matthew disappeared. Where had he been on June 13th? Richard said he'd worked his usual shift, 10 at night until 6 in the morning on the 14th. He'd come home, slept, woken up around 10, and then Jody had left for the store. But when investigators checked with the warehouse, they learned Richard had actually left work early that night. He'd clocked out at 4:30 in the morning, an hour and a half before his shift ended. He'd told his supervisor he felt ill. This was new information. Investigators asked Richard about it. He seemed confused at first, then admitted yes, he'd forgotten. He had left early. He'd felt sick. He'd come home and gone straight to bed. Clears throat. Timeline shifted. If Richard had gotten home at 5 in the morning instead of 6:30, that changed nothing immediately obvious, but it was another inconsistency. Another small thing that didn't quite fit. Investigators asked what kind of sick he'd felt. Stomach, headache. Richard said he couldn't remember exactly, just sick, tired. They asked if he'd vomited, if he'd taken medicine. He said no, he just slept. But Jody told investigators she hadn't known Richard had come home early. She'd been asleep and hadn't heard him arrive. When she'd woken around 7, he was in bed beside her asleep. She'd assumed he'd come home at his usual time. This meant there were nearly 3 hours, from roughly 5 in the morning until Jody woke around 7, that were unaccounted for in Richard's timeline. What had he done during those hours? He said he'd slept. Just slept. Investigators executed a search warrant on the Sanchez home. They took computers, Richard's truck, clothing, shoes. They searched for blood evidence, hair, fibers. They found nothing conclusive. The truck was clean, very clean. Richard said he'd washed it recently. When? He wasn't sure, maybe a week ago, maybe less. Deputies noted that the truck bed had been scrubbed thoroughly. There were still water spots visible on the metal. The mats had been removed. Richard said he'd taken them out to clean them, that they'd gotten muddy. But Estrella Vista hadn't seen rain in over a month. Where had the mud come from? Richard said maybe it was dust, not mud. He couldn't remember clearly. The investigation continued through July and August. Tips still came in, but nothing broke the case open. The community held vigils. Yellow ribbons appeared on trees and mailboxes throughout Estrella Vista. Matthew's face looked out from telephone poles and grocery store bulletin boards. His family waited. Jody gave interviews to anyone who would listen. Richard stopped speaking to the press. His lawyer, whom he'd retained in late June, advised against it. This didn't look good to the public or to investigators, but it was his right. By September, the active search operations had ended. The case remained open, but the daily efforts wound down. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves that they believed the father knew more than he'd said. But belief isn't evidence. The case went cold. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the ground shift beneath a relationship you thought was solid, the months that followed Matthew's disappearance were a descent into uncertainty for Jody Sanchez. She went through the motions of daily life. She made meals. She drove Christina to school. She answered the phone when investigators called with updates that were never really updates, just confirmations that nothing had changed. But inside the house, the atmosphere grew dense with things unsaid. Richard went back to work at the warehouse. He came home. He ate dinner. He watched television. He seemed to Jody like a man moving through fog, present but not really there. She tried to talk to him about Matthew. He would nod but say little. Once in October 2002, she asked him directly, late at night when Christina was asleep, if there was anything he hadn't told the investigators, anything at all. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read and said, "No, there's nothing." But Jody's doubts had been planted, and they grew, small things. The way Richard had been so calm that first day, the inconsistencies in his timeline, the overly clean truck. She began to notice how he avoided looking at Matthew's photos around the house, how he never spoke the boy's name. Christina, now 13, grew quiet and withdrawn. She stopped reading as much. She had nightmares. Jody would find her awake at 3 in the morning, sitting in the dark. What if he's calling for us and we can't hear him? Christina asked once. Jody had no answer. She held her daughter and felt the weight of all the questions pressing down. By spring of 2003, Jody had made a decision. She couldn't stay in that house anymore. Couldn't stay with Richard. Whether he was involved in Matthew's disappearance or not, the marriage had become a hollow thing, emptied out by grief and suspicion. She filed for separation in April. Richard didn't fight it. He moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. Jody and Christina stayed in the house for another few months, then relocated to Tucson, where Jody's sister lived. They needed distance, needed to start over somewhere Matthew's face wasn't on every telephone pole. The divorce was finalized in early 2004. Richard had visitation rights with Christina, but she refused to see him after the first few months. By the time she turned 15, they had no contact at all. The years passed slowly. 2004, 2005, 2006. The case file for Matthew Sanchez remained open, but no new leads emerged. Jody tried to build a new life in Tucson. She went back to work as a dental assistant. Christina graduated high school and went to community college. They both went to therapy. They both carried Matthew with them every day, a presence that never faded. Jody sometimes woke thinking she heard him in the next room, that running narration he used to do while playing. Then she'd remember. On what would have been Matthew's 16th birthday in 2010, she held a small memorial. She released balloons in a park. She posted about him on social media sites that were becoming popular, hoping someone somewhere might remember something. The post was shared a few hundred times. Nothing came of it. Clears throat. Richard, for his part, remained in the Phoenix area. He changed jobs several times. He remarried briefly in 2008, but that marriage lasted less than a year. Those who knew him during that period said he was difficult to get close to. He kept people at arm's length. He drank more than he should. He was always alone. If he thought about Matthew, if he grieved, he did it privately. He never spoke about his son to coworkers or the few acquaintances he had. When the anniversary of Matthew's disappearance came around each June, he didn't acknowledge it publicly. It was as if he'd closed a door on that part of his life and locked it. But Christina remembered everything. As she grew older, the memories became sharper rather than softer. She remembered the way her father had been that day, the strange calm, the way he'd sat on the porch while everyone searched. She remembered asking him once, years before Matthew disappeared, why he seemed angry so much. He told her he wasn't angry, just tired. But she'd seen the way he looked at Matthew sometimes. Like the boy's energy exhausted him. Like Matthew was a problem to be managed. She'd been 12 when her brother vanished. Too young to articulate what she'd sensed. But as she grew into her 20s, she began to see the pattern of things. The silences, the evasions. In 2018, at the age of 28, Christina was living in Phoenix again, working as a paralegal. She'd married. She had a daughter of her own, a little girl named Sophie. Becoming a mother changed something in Christina, made the past feel urgent in a new way. She thought about Matthew constantly, thought about what kind of uncle he would have been. She thought about her father too. She hadn't spoken to Richard in over a decade, but she knew he still lived in the area. One afternoon in September 2018, she made a decision. She called the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak to someone about her brother's case. The detective who took her call was named Sarah Morno. Detective Morno had been with the department for 12 years but had only recently been assigned to review cold cases. Matthew Sanchez's file was one she'd been reading. She'd noted all the inconsistencies from 2002, the timeline discrepancies, the clean truck, the father's strange demeanor, but without evidence, without a body, the case had stalled. When Christina called, Detective Morno listened carefully. Christina said she wanted to share something she'd never told anyone, a memory that had been bothering her for years. On the morning Matthew disappeared, Christina had been in her room reading, but she'd heard her father's voice. Not loud, just the low murmur of him talking to someone. She'd assumed he was on the phone, but now, thinking back, she wasn't sure. The voice had seemed closer than the kitchen where the phone was. It had seemed to come from outside, from the backyard maybe. She remembered feeling mildly curious, but not enough to get up and look. She'd been absorbed in her book, but the timing stuck with her. It had been after her mother left for the store. She was certain of that. Maybe around 11, maybe a few minutes after. Detective Morno asked Christina if she'd mentioned this to investigators in 2002. Christina said no. No one had asked her specifically about sounds she'd heard. They'd asked if she'd seen Matthew leave, if she'd seen anyone suspicious. They'd asked about the general mourning, but not that specific detail. It had seemed unimportant at the time. Now, 16 years later, it felt significant. If Richard had been talking to someone outside around 11, who was it? Matthew. Someone else. He'd told investigators he'd been in the shower around that time. But Christina was certain she'd heard his voice. She would recognize her father's voice anywhere. Detective Morneau thanked Christina and said she'd look into it. She reopened the case file with fresh eyes. She reviewed all the old interviews, the timeline, the evidence collected. She noticed something that had been noted in 2002 but never fully pursued. Richard's truck had been processed for evidence and photographed extensively. In one photograph of the truck bed, taken from above, there was a small stain on the metal near the wheel well. It had been tested and came back as inconclusive for blood, but modern forensic techniques had advanced significantly since 2002. Detective Morneau wondered if the sample could be retested with better technology. She submitted the request. It took 3 months for the lab to get back to her. The results came in December 2018. The stain was blood, human blood, and the DNA matched Matthew Sanchez. Clear's throat. The discovery changed everything. Blood in the truck bed meant Matthew had been in that truck bed at some point, injured. The question was when. Richard claimed he'd washed the truck around the time Matthew disappeared, possibly even the day before. Why would he wash it so thoroughly? And if Matthew had been injured in the truck bed, where was he now? Detective Morneau obtained a warrant to bring Richard in for questioning. On January 8, 2019, 2 detectives arrived at Richard's apartment. He was 60 years old now, grayer and thinner than he'd been in 2002, but still recognizable. He seemed unsurprised to see them. He'd been expecting this, he said. They asked him to come to the station. He agreed without calling a lawyer. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Detective Morneau and her partner walked Richard through the timeline again. They asked about the shower, about the truck, about the blood. Richard maintained his story initially. He didn't know how blood got in the truck. Maybe Matthew had scraped his knee weeks before and bled there. Maybe it was old, but the detectives pressed. They told him the blood had been found in a location that suggested more than a scraped knee. They told him they knew he'd been outside that morning talking to someone, that Christina had heard his voice. Richard's composure began to crack. He put his head in his hands. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "It was an accident." The room went still. Detective Morneau asked him to explain. Richard's voice was quiet. He said he'd been working on his truck that morning in the garage. Matthew had come in asking questions, asking to help. Richard told him to go play, but Matthew persisted. He was always persisting, always asking, always needing attention. Richard said he'd snapped. He'd grabbed Matthew by the arm harder than he meant to. Matthew had cried out. Richard told him to be quiet. He dragged him outside through the back gate to discipline him away from the house, away from where Jody might hear if she came home early. He said he'd only meant to scare the boy. To make him understand, he needed to listen. But Matthew had tried to run. Richard caught him. There was a struggle. Matthew fell and hit his head on a rock. He went still. Richard said he'd panicked. He'd picked Matthew up and put him in the truck bed. He'd driven into the desert, out past the developed areas where the land was empty and endless. He'd buried him in a shallow spot near a dry wash. He'd marked it in his mind but wasn't sure he could find it again after all these years. The desert changed. Erosion moved things. Storms rearranged the landscape. He'd come back home, washed the truck, showered, and waited for Jody to return. He'd planned to say Matthew had wandered off. He'd convinced himself he could sell the story, and for 17 years he had. The confession was recorded. Richard was arrested on January 8, 2019 and charged initially with manslaughter and concealment of a body. The story broke the next morning. The media coverage was extensive. Arizona newspapers ran the story on front pages. National news picked it up. The community of Estrella Vista, much larger now than it had been in 2002, reacted with shock. Some residents had been there since the beginning and remembered the search. Others were newer and knew the story only as local legend. Richard Sanchez was the quiet man in the apartment complex. No one had suspected. Those who knew him said he'd seemed ordinary. Lonely maybe, but ordinary. Search teams returned to the desert with Richard's directions. They covered the area he described, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. The landscape had indeed changed. 17 years of weathering had eroded gullies, shifted sand, buried and exposed rocks. But on January 20th, 2019, a team working in a dry wash approximately 43 miles west of Estrella Vista found remains. Partially buried, partially exposed by erosion. Small bones wrapped in fabric that had once been a green shirt with a dinosaur on it. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. They'd found Matthew Sanchez. The case moved to trial. Richard's lawyer argued that the confession had been coerced, that Richard had been exhausted and confused, but the evidence was there. The blood in the truck, the timeline inconsistencies, the body recovered in the location Richard described. The jury deliberated for 2 days. In August 2019, Richard Sanchez was convicted of second-degree manslaughter and abuse of a corpse. The judge sentenced him to 28 years in prison. He would be eligible for parole in 18 years, though given his age, it was unlikely he'd survive his sentence. Clears throat. Jody attended every day of the trial. She sat in the front row and stared at the man she'd once loved, the father of her children. She tried to understand how someone could do what he'd done, how you could hold your child's body and choose to hide it rather than call for help, how you could let a mother search desperately while you knew the truth all along. She would never understand it, but she had Matthew back now. She could bury him properly. She could give him the goodbye that had been stolen 17 years earlier. Christina spoke at the sentencing hearing. She read a statement about growing up in the shadow of her brother's disappearance, about the nights she'd woken terrified, about the way her childhood had ended that June afternoon, about becoming a mother herself and understanding finally the magnitude of what had been taken. She looked at her father directly and said, "I heard you that morning. I heard your voice and I didn't know what it meant. I was 12 years old. I didn't know, but you knew. And you let us suffer. You let Mom suffer. You let Matthew lie alone in the desert for 17 years. I hope you think about that every single day for the rest of your life." Richard showed no emotion. He stared straight ahead. When asked if he wanted to address the court, he declined. His lawyer made a statement about remorse, but Richard himself said nothing. He was led away in handcuffs. The gallery was silent. Some people cried. Others just sat, processing the weight of it all. Matthew Sanchez was laid to rest in a cemetery in Tucson on September 7, 2019. The service was small, family and close friends. The headstone bore his name, his dates, and a single line, "Forever 8, forever loved." Jody planted a small tree nearby, a Palo Verde that would bloom green and gold each spring. Christina brought her daughter Sophie to visit sometimes. She told Sophie about the uncle she'd never meet, about the boy who collected rocks and built forts and asked questions constantly. She told her to remember him. The case closed officially in October 2019. The file was marked solved. Justice, such as it was, had been served. But justice is a word that means different things to different people. For those who searched in the heat that June, for those who hung yellow ribbons and hoped, for a sister who heard her father's voice and didn't understand what it meant until years later, for a mother who walked into her house and found her son simply gone. For them, justice was incomplete. Matthew was still gone. The years were still lost, but the truth had finally been spoken aloud. The silence had been broken, And perhaps that was something. Perhaps that was enough. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.